And now Hugh Laurie continues his reading of The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Dr. Watson has accompanied Sir Henry Baskerville to his ancient family seat on the edge of Dartmoor. Their arrival at night, with tales of an escaped convict on the moor and the strange sounds of a sobbing woman in the early hours of the morning, have left Dr. Watson uneasy, and he wishes that Sherlock Holmes had been able to come with them rather than staying behind to attend to his affairs in London.
As Sir Henry and I sat at breakfast, the sunlight flooded in through the high mullioned windows of Baskerville Hall, effacing from both our minds the grim impression of the night before. "I guess it's ourselves and not the house we have to blame," said the baronet. "We were tired with our journey." "And yet it wasn't entirely a question of imagination," I answered. "Did you, for example, happen to hear a woman sobbing in the night?" "I did fancy I heard something when I was half asleep, but there was no more of it, so I concluded it was all a dream." "Well, I heard it distinctly," I said. Sir Henry immediately rang the bell and asked Barrymore whether he could account for our experience. It seemed to me that the pallid features of the butler turned a shade paler as he answered his master. "There are only 2 women in the house, Sir Henry. One's the scullery maid, who sleeps in the other wing. The other's my wife, and the sound couldn't have come from her." And yet he lied. For it chanced that after breakfast I met Mrs. Barrymore in the long corridor with the sun full upon her face. Her telltale eyes were red and swollen. Why had Barrymore declared it was not so? And why did she weep so bitterly? Already round this handsome black-bearded man there was gathering an atmosphere of mystery. It was he who'd been the first to discover the body of Sir Charles. Was it possible that it was Barrymore, after all, who followed Sir Henry in the cab in London? I decided to see the Grimpen postmaster and find whether the test telegram had really been placed in Barrymore's own hands. It was a pleasant walk along the edge of the moor to the small grey hamlet. The postmaster had a clear recollection of the telegram. "My boy here, James, delivered it." "Into Mr. Barrymore's own hands?" I asked. The boy shifted uneasily. "Well, he was up in the loft at the time, but I gave it to Mrs. Barrymore, and she promised to deliver it at once." So it seemed we had no proof that Barrymore had not been in London. Suppose that it was so. What then? Was he the agent of others, or had he some sinister design of his own? I thought of the strange warning clipped out of the leading article of the Times. "As you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." Was that his work? Or was it possibly the doing of someone who was bent upon counteracting his schemes? My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of running feet behind me and a voice which called my name. The stranger was a small, slim, prim-faced man between 30 and 40 years of age, wearing a straw hat and carrying a green butterfly net. "You will, I'm sure, excuse my presumption, Dr. Watson. Here on the moor we're homely folk, and don't wait for formal introductions. You may possibly have heard my name from our mutual friend, Dr. Mortimer. I am Stapleton of Merripit House. Mortimer pointed you out to me, and as our road lay the same way, I thought we could walk together. I trust Sir Henry's none the worse for his journey?" "He's very well, thank you." "We were all rather afraid that after the sad death of Sir Charles, the new baronet might refuse to live here. Sir Henry has, I suppose, no superstitious fears in the matter. It's extraordinary how credulous the peasants are about here. Any number of them are ready to swear that they have seen this fiend dog upon the moor." He spoke with a smile, but I seemed to read in his eyes that he took the matter more seriously. "The story took a great hold upon the imagination of Sir Charles, and I have no doubt that it led to his tragic end." "But how?" I asked. "His nerves were so worked up that the appearance of any dog might have had a fatal effect on his diseased heart. I fancy he did see something of the kind that last night in the yew alley. I feared that some disaster might occur, for I was very fond of the old man, and I knew that his heart was weak." "You think, then, that some dog pursued Sir Charles, and that he died of fright in consequence. Well, have you any better explanation? I haven't come to any conclusion, I said. Well, if there's any possible way in which I can be of service to you, I trust that you'll command me. We'd come to a point where a narrow, grassy path struck off from the road and wound away across the moor. A moderate walk along this path brings us to Merripit House, said he. Perhaps you'll spare an hour that I may have the pleasure of introducing you to my sister. My first thought was that I should be by Sir Henry's side, but Holmes had expressly said that I should study the neighbours on the moor, so I accepted Stapleton's invitation, and we turned together down the path. It's a wonderful place, the moor, said he. You cannot think the wonderful secrets it contains. You know it well, then. I've only been here 2 years, but my tastes led me to explore every part of the country, and I should think that there are few men who know it better. You see, for example, this great plain to the north. Do you observe anything remarkable about it? It would be a rare place for a gallop. Stapleton laughed. You'd naturally think so, and that thought has cost folk their lives before now. You notice those bright green spots scattered thickly over it? That's Grimpen Mire. A false step yonder means death to man or beast. Only yesterday I saw one of the moor ponies wander into it. He never came out. I saw his head for quite a long time craning out of the bog hole, but it sucked him down at last. And yet I can find my way to the very heart of it and return alive. But why should you wish to go into so horrible a place? Because that's where the rare plants and butterflies are. A long moan, indescribably sad, swept over the moor. It filled the whole air, and yet it was impossible to say whence it came. Stapleton looked at me with a curious expression on his face. The peasants say that's the Hound of the Baskervilles calling for its prey. I looked round with a chill of fear in my heart. Nothing stirred over the vast expanse, save a pair of ravens which croaked loudly from a tor behind us. You're an educated man. You don't believe such nonsense, I said. What do you think is the cause of so strange a sound? Bogs make queer noises sometimes. It's the mud settling or the water rising or something. It's the weirdest thing that I ever heard. It's a rather uncanny place altogether. Look at the hillside. Those rings of stone are the homes of our ancestors. Prehistoric man lived thickly on the moor. He grazed his cattle on these slopes, and he learned to dig for tin. Oh, excuse me. A small moth fluttered across our path, and in an instant Stapleton was rushing with extraordinary energy and speed in pursuit of it. To my dismay, the creature flew straight for the great mire, but my acquaintance never paused for an instant, bounding from tuft to tuft, his green net waving in the air. I was standing watching his pursuit with a mixture of admiration and fear when I heard the sound of steps. A woman approached me from the direction of Merripit House, and I could not doubt that this was Miss Stapleton. I remembered that I'd heard someone describe her as being a beauty, and the woman who approached me was certainly that. There couldn't have been a greater contrast between brother and sister. Her eyes were on her brother as I turned, and then she quickened her pace towards me. "Go back," she said. "Go straight back to London." I could only stare at her in stupid surprise. "For God's sake, do what I ask of you, and never set foot upon the moor again. Hush now, my brother's coming. Not a word of what I've said." Stapleton had abandoned the chase and came back to us. "Halloa, Beryl," said he, and it seemed to me that the tone of his greeting was not altogether a cordial one. His small eyes glanced incessantly from the girl to me. "You've introduced yourselves, I see." "I was just telling Sir Henry that it was rather late for him to see the true beauties of the moor." I smiled. No, you mistake me. My name is Dr. Watson." A flush of vexation passed over her face. "Then we've been talking at cross purposes. Forgive me." From the outside, Merripit was a bleak moorland house, But inside there were large rooms furnished with an elegance in which I recognized the taste of the lady. I resisted all pressure to stay for lunch, and having assured Stapleton that Sir Henry would be delighted if he called upon us, I set off on the path back to Baskerville Hall. It seems, however, that there must have been a shortcut, for before I'd reached the road I found Miss Stapleton sitting upon a rock by the side of the track. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am about the stupid mistake. Please forget the words I said, Dr. Watson." "As a friend of Sir Henry's, I feel I should ask you what you meant by them," I replied. "It's just that I was very fond of Sir Charles. You know the story of the hound." "But I don't believe in such nonsense." "Well, I do. If you have any influence with Sir Henry, take him away from a place which has always been fatal to his family. But please don't tell my brother we've spoken. He's very anxious to have the Hall inhabited for the good of the poor folk on the moor." With that, she took her leave. Some days later, I completed my first report to London. "My dear Holmes, Mr. Stapleton came over to call upon Baskerville on our first day, and the very next morning he took us both to the spot where the legend of Sir Hugo is supposed to have had its origin. On our way back we stayed for lunch at Merripit House, and it was there that Sir Henry made the acquaintance of Miss Stapleton. From the first moment he saw her, he appeared to be strongly attracted to her, and I am much mistaken if the feeling was not mutual. Since then, hardly a day has passed that we haven't seen something of the brother and sister. One would imagine that such a match would be very welcome to Stapleton, and yet I have more than once caught a look of the strongest disapprobation in his face. One other neighbour I have met is Mr. Frankland of Laughter Hall. He's an elderly man with a passion for the British law, and has spent a large fortune in litigation. He fights for the mere pleasure of fighting. Sometimes he'll shut a right-of-way and defy the parish to make him open it. At others he'll tear down some other man's gate and declare that a path has existed there from time immemorial. Apart from the law, he seems a kindly person, and I only mention him because you were particular that I should send some description of the people who surround us. He's curiously employed at present. For being an amateur astronomer, he has an excellent telescope, with which he sweeps the moor in the hope of catching a glimpse of the escaped convict. Mrs. Barrymore remains of interest to me. Some deep sorrow clearly gnaws at her heart. I wondered if it had to do with Mr. Barrymore, and the adventure of last night brings my suspicions to a head. You're aware that I'm not a sound sleeper, and since I've been on guard in this house, my slumbers have been lighter than ever. Last night, about 2 a.m, I was aroused by a stealthy step passing my room. I rose, opened my door, and peeped out. A long black shadow was trailing down the corridor. It was thrown by a man who was walking softly down the passage with a candle in his hand. He was in shirt and trousers, with no covering to his feet. I could merely see the outline, but his height told me that it was Barrymore. He walked very slowly and circumspectly, and there was something indescribably guilty and furtive in his whole appearance. So I followed him. At the end of the far corridor, he entered an empty room, and as he left the door ajar, I peeped round. He was crouching at the window with the candle held against the glass. His face was rigid with expectation. For some minutes he stood watching intently. Then he gave a deep groan and put out the light impatiently. Instantly I made my way back to my room, and very shortly came the stealthy steps passing once more. Some time later I heard a key turn in a lock. What it all means I cannot guess, but there is surely some secret business going on in this house of gloom.
Hugh Laurie has been reading The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The programme was abridged and produced for Radio 2 by Jane Marshall Productions.